That's fine, yeah.
Okay. I think, yes, Trump. I mentioned Mount. His speech there, for those who haven't heard it, included in our schools, our news, even our corporate boardrooms, there is a new far-left fascism that demands our allegiance. If you do not speak its language, perform its rituals, recite its mantras, or its commandments, then you will be censored, banished, blacklisted, persecuted, and punished. They want to silence us, but we will not be silenced. Now, this is President Trump. If anyone thinks that Trump has been silenced, I mean, you know, if only had been such a thing. But that is, yes, what he's trying to say is that he's actually talking about is the Black Lives Matter movement, the raising of all this stuff about racism that's going on in it, and he hates it. And I think that that's one of the issues. One of the things about the movement that's happening at the moment is it's about questioning everything. And I think this relates to statues, which is why the topic becomes interesting. And to the giant statues of Lenin, because I think one of the things about statues of Lenin was that Lenin was an important leader who I think should be celebrated as such, but he was someone who was a leader who could be questioned. One of the things about making these giant statues was turning him into a god. Gods can't be questioned, be queried. And it wasn't really about questioning what Lenin said, it was about what Stalin was doing. So the people who were coming after Lenin were saying, don't query any of the stuff he said, we interpret it correctly, you do as you're told. And I think that that is something that a lot of these ideas of giant statues commemorate. Now, as individuals should be remembered, I think sometimes it is quite important to remember individuals and what I'm less worried about people of the scale of, you know, Marx and Lenin, but I think that lots of people just simply get written out of history. So to take, well, it came up some of the stuff about the fight against the slave trade. Oluda Ek was one of these former slaves who campaigned around Britain. He's an interesting person. William Cuffay is someone who's little remembered now. He was the leader of the Chartist movement, the first mass working class movement in the world. Now, much of the Chartist movement was in the north, and the national leaders were both Irish, O'Connor and but I think the interesting thing is that you saw a movement that came up by British workers, many of whom would have been very racist, would have been on how stupid and evil the Irish were. When they went into struggle, they got people at their head, and in London, a former, he wasn't a former slave, he was the son of a former slave, who was there. These people, I think, should be remembered, partly because they're not, partly because what the ruling class has done has tried to push these people out of history and to suggest that their people are great. And one of the things that's interesting, I suppose, in the past, there was a thing where conquest was good. The British were great and served everything they've done. It's interesting, talking about having rotating statues on, because this is one thing that does happen in London. In Trafalgar Square, leaving aside Nelson, there are 4 plinths in the square which never had a statue put on it, and currently that has a rotating statue. It's interesting at the other ones. One of them is of Henry Havelock. Someone knows, but it does say on it, put up by grateful fans, so that he was forgotten. And one of the things he did was help put down the Indian Uprising in 1857, things which the British establishment wanted remembered. And I think that there are some things that we want remembered in different ways. I think that I would disagree with the idea of just putting something on saying exactly what they did, because having things up authentically is a suggestion that they are in somehow something that should be admired. I think interesting to look at wider things. For instance, people mention blue plus. There are other coloured plaques. These are all to remember various sorts of or less famous people or events. Sometimes I think people should, but sometimes less so. Sometimes these things change, and I think it's the idea that things are permanent. But it's also the case that you have street names. Do we want street names? Some I think should be. Not much of East London, where I've lived for much of my life, is named great Victorian battles, how the empire was built. I used to live on Dongola Road. I discovered that Dongola was a town in the Sudan where the British had massacred people during the Sudanese wars. These kinds of things, you wonder, is it better that the road name stays to remember some of those people, or is it better that they should change them to stop having a commemoration of British military victories? These are things which will come up in the future, and hopefully will come up with more democracy, because that's another thing that comes. Actually, who gets a say in these things? Because when we're talking about decolonizing education, partly it's about saying we want an education which is about wider life. Now, again, I've talked about Aluda Equiano was a former slave. They talked about William Cuffay, who was, I think it's worth remembering some other people, like in all the things about the slave trade. It is worth remembering someone like, I've now forgotten his name, Thompson, who set up the campaign in Britain to end the slave trade, and was in the late 1800s, started a national campaign, which in the end was successful. He is sort of remembered, but I think he should be more remembered, that there are lots of people like who were on the other side. And I mention him particularly because you have the thing where lots of people will say about people like Colston or other people, slave owners, well, of course, everyone was at the time. And it is worth remembering that there was a mass campaign of slavery in Britain in the 18th century, which was in the end combined with slave uprising, why they got rid of the slave trade in the first place. So that is something that's worth remembering. And it is worth remembering the other things. There was a mention of sugar, which was that the idea that people should be, made to take. It is worth remembering in terms of British people, of course, that the idea when people's teeth falling out and false teeth was something that came in after the mass importing of sugar, but that's sort of by the by. In terms of building the empire, it is worth saying as often as possible about the opium. This was when Britain had conquered India, was growing opium there, and demanded free trade to sell in China. The Chinese government said no, so aided and forced them to take opium, and that incidentally is how Britain initially got Hong Kong. So, with all these things, I think the thing to say about this is that things can change. How things are understood partly depends on the circumstances. So, for instance, about the people who are arrested for throwing the statue in the harbour after poll tax, many years ago that was now, many people got off because they had jury courts and people just found them innocent when they were arrested for various things. Otherwise, their fines paid. Just in terms of what statues there are, if they're a representation of history, we don't know how people reproduce because there weren't any women in history. Like, I don't know how many statues of women there are in the country. It's hardly any. Just to finish, I think it's a political question. It's always a matter of debate about what's going on. We're going to talk about decolonisation. It has to link to wider things about how societies run, why what used to be run by slavers, what we're going to do. Another of Trump's things was, if you take down war leaders, where will it end? Are you going to take down George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, set up the American state, because they were slave owners too? And I think there's an issue that it might well do. Things which should be democratically sorted out. They should be sorted out by the mass of the people. I suspect, instead of just in terms of the wider questions about what art there should be, it will be art that commemorates people who aren't much commemorated, because things of big people are about, big statues are often of big people. and the majority of people, whatever they've done, is rarely. Sometimes you get murals, as in Cable Street, which has a beautiful big mural there, of the mass of people, the lives they've led, and the things they've done. These are things which should be commemorated some way, but I think will be when people have more of a stake and more control, which is why we need to change society to be in a situation where ordinary people do have more. I think that requires a shift towards socialism. I've almost certainly left some things out, but I'm going to. So thanks, and I hope I haven't missed much. Thanks.